know, this is part 2 of disaster training, so I don't want to take up any more of your time, so I'm going to hand it back to Margie. And again, thank you. And is the wonderful Executive Director, Margie Russell.
Thank you, Greg. Last session we did this, it was in December, and it concentrated mostly on infrastructure and readiness. And we'll be talking about some of that, but today the emphasis is on the administrative side. And so we want to draw that out from the speakers, because their heads are full of both topics, but they know they came here to talk about that. These speakers, I'm co-moderating this with Erwin Cohen from A. Michael Parry Realty. And so our speakers are James Barry, who's Program Coordinator at 32BJ, the curriculum. He's going to tell you what they're doing to ready your staff for this. We have James Fenneman from Bollinger Insurance, Rob Sincere from Daniels, Norelli, Sincere, and Scully, Josh Goldman from Bar Gold Storage. So with that, Erwin, you have 1 or 2 things, or you want to question the speakers as we go along? Okay, all right. And my instructions to the speakers are, you can use any one of these mics. You know, this seems a little more comfortable unless you want to use some reading material. Okay, so with that, James Fenneman from Bollinger Insurance. Welcome.
James Fenneman, that's my name. I'm Executive Vice President of Bollinger. We're a large regional insurance brokerage firm, and we represent about 1,000 co-ops and condos, and I head up Bollinger's construction real estate practice, and I'm also an adjunct professor at St. John's University School of Risk Management. I'm going to kind of follow the disaster preparedness outline, which many of you have on the desk, and it's just a little roadmap to get you focused about the different sides of risk. In the last 12 years, we've had 2 major catastrophes in New York, one of course being a man-made 9/11, and if we want to put Sandy in a major New York City catastrophe, I think it's certainly noteworthy under the natural. Using those 2 benchmarks, everyone in this room certainly had a wake-up call after 9/11. A lot of preparedness, a lot of new ideas about disaster planning went into effect, especially if your building or where you were working was near a perceived terrorist zone. And that set a lot of stage for overall real estate community in New York to take a much more proactive role, especially folks here at 32BJ with all the new security apparatus that we have in the office buildings, all of the various security that went into effect in the residential side. And now, after Sandy, we have a whole new look at what a natural disaster can do to New York City. And we have a whole new approach towards flood preparedness. The Army Corps of Engineers, as we speak, is remapping and rezoning a lot of areas in New York. And if you look at Manhattan, take south of 14th Street all the way up into Chelsea on the west side, major impacts, huge impact on the development side, huge impact on a lot of co-ops and condos along that corridor, huge impact on the art dealers. $300 or $400 million worth of art was lost in Sandy, in Chelsea, in Tribeca, which not a lot of folks know about. And if you go on the east side, all the way up to probably, as we called it right after Sandy, the haves and the have-nots, as we called 34th Street. North was the haves and south was the have-nots. Living in East Village, I was a have-not, and it was quite an experience. So where are we now? everybody, hopefully, if they didn't already, have some kind of a disaster plan in place for the types of buildings that you're involved in, whether you're in a brownstone or a large multifamily unit. And if you're in the Rockaways, you certainly, hopefully, have come up with a very good plan, because that's probably the word, and the whole barrier islands into Long Beach and out into Nassau County. But if you look at the outline that we've prepared, we basically look at natural events and unnatural events. We're not looking at insurance, we're looking at it as a risk management approach. Risk management basically is saying, what can you do to reduce your risk? Reduce the frequency and reduce the severity. That's what you're trying to do. Don't even think about insurance. Insurance is just a funding mechanism for the risks that you can't control or reduce or eliminate. So once you have your arms around what you perceive your risk to be, coming up with an emergency planning steps on page 2 is, first you want to establish a team that will be working with your managing agent to make sure that you have identified all of the risks and what you can do to prepare for them. And a mission statement, and you want to communicate it to the shareholders or tenants. And then there will be an emergency system set up with important telephone numbers, whether public, state, or local resources, so that everyone in the building knows what the procedures are going to be. If there's an evacuation, how is it going to be evacuated? We never thought about evacuation in this town. Now we do. It can happen. We could not get back in our office for 90 days, even though we're on the 25th floor in Water Street, because we had 6 feet of salt water in our lobby, which went down into the whole infrastructure and knocked out all of the mechanicals for the building. So you leave on a Friday, and you can't get back in your building, in your office for, well, it's a good 45 days before they even let us back in. You have to make sure you're prepared. And no one left on Friday knowing that we were not coming back in for 45 days. It was just going to be another one of those storms that we know about. Fortunately, a lot of people, Margie talks about the technology, but this was a lifeline for many of us. And that's why when you get into the preparedness, cell phone numbers are going to be very important, because many times your landlines will be knocked out, or your cell phones will be knocked out and your landlines might work, which happened to be the case where I live in Manhattan. We had no cell phone service, but we had landline service. But you can't have electronic digital phones. You have to have an old-fashioned, not rotary, but at least a push-button phone. Now that's something that, who would have guessed that maybe you have to have a number of old-fashioned phones, trim lines, princess phones. They were the only ones working in a lot of neighborhoods after Sandy. So you develop the plan, response procedures, go over maybe a dry run, make sure that you communicate properly. We do it a lot in our buildings on fire drills. Now we may have to start doing it for other natural disasters. And then you implement the plan. Very simple. Establish a team, analyze capabilities, develop the plan, and implement the plan. There are a lot of templates around. I know the real estate management community has been working diligently, especially with 32BJ and a lot of other service providers, in giving everybody the resources to properly set this up. What this does is it gives everyone in the house a feeling of comfort that we have a plan. We know what we're going to do if certain tragedies happen, whether they be natural or unnatural. An information facilitator is good. Someone who will be directly involved from the board or from the tenants association with the management firm, so that the managing agent is not trying to communicate with 200 to 300 people in a larger building. Maybe by floors, you can set them up where you have a floor coordinator, so that if a 12-story building, you have 12 people responsible, who are going to one person who's then going to the management firm who might be coordinating a lot of the emergency response teams. Protecting your building. We're now seeing around the corner from us, with the storm that came the last few days, we saw sandbags. People were putting sandbags by office buildings. I mean, this is where we are right now. But after 9/11, we saw a lot of barriers going up in front of buildings, in residential areas, with any of the perceived, remember when we had all the different color alerts, but it turned out we were living in orange all the time, so nothing really, the barriers have stayed there until everyone felt a certain level of comfort. The emergency plan should include evacuation routes, fire emergency evacuation drills, a buddy system, especially for seniors. You heard a lot of stories of how seniors had to be evacuated, especially out in the Rockaways. We had some senior housing, some Section 8 housing. That's a very critical area, so each floor coordinator could know how many seniors that might have difficulty getting out of the 12th floor if the elevators are not working. How are you going to get them out? These are the kind of things that could be in the plan, depending upon the population of your building. And of course, the last is just routine types of checklists. As far as the insurance recoveries, the more information, the more data, the more photographs, the more pre-existing conditions you have, photographs before the loss and after, all helpful. It is basically supporting your claim. A lot of what goes into the recovery aspects of insurance policies is that you make sure that you put all of your loss in, especially excess labor, premium labor, all of that is recoverable. You have to support it. But if I want you to walk away with one thing today, is that you go on the NewYorkCityGov.com or NewYorkCity.gov and find out where your building is in the flood zones. The insurance industry is changing. We're going to have more availability problems. FEMA is a restricted policy. It only has a $500,000 maximum limit. It doesn't have business income. It doesn't have replacement cost, while the private sector policies do. And what you're going to have to do is patch together to make sure that you have adequate flood insurance. And many of the carriers are not going to be offering the private policies that they did for different zones. We don't know exactly how it's all going to play out. It's work in progress right now because we're all waiting for the Army Corps of Engineers remappings to come out. But I can tell you it's going to be more costly, especially if you're in a flood zone. And what we're hoping is that maybe FEMA, if Congress can focus on it, versus just signing emergency bills at the last minute, maybe they'll bring the limits up to $1 million, maybe give replacement costs, maybe some business income coverage, but we can't count on it. So you have to know that it's restricted form. The carriers are not going to be offering as much as they used to. They used to offer, many of them, $1 million or $2 million with a $10,000 deductible. Those are going to be eroding to people who are outside of the, if you're in a flood zone, most likely you're probably not going to have that available to you anymore. And that's what I have so far. I'm sure a few more questions will come up.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. Yes, yes.
I have a couple of questions, James. The insurance industry is very interested in protecting against risk. So normally, as a managing agent, when I place a policy on a building, they'll say the sidewalk is cracked, you have to replace the sidewalk. What is the insurance industry doing to help cooperative condominiums, property owners, in terms of emergency preparedness? In order to minimize the risk, I would assume that the industry would be somehow contributory toward helping property owners, shareholders, and condominium owners in developing procedures, methods, in order to safeguard property. As simple as raising a platform to keep your snow melt all out of 5 feet of water. That's one question. The other question that I had for the insurance is, it's kind of like it's related to flood zone that you just mentioned. They're remapping flood zones. A lot of shareholders and unit owners right now are trying to get loans. A lot of them are coming out of Fannie Mae, as you know. Fannie Mae is requiring elevation certificates on buildings. We can't seem to get those. We can't get them cost effectively, and they're remapping. So how do we deal with that? Because people are being turned down for a building that normally didn't need a certificate, flood certificate. And now we're stuck, and people are getting a little angry that they can't do the things that they want to do to either buy, sell, or rent, or whatever. Okay, so those are the questions.
Okay. As far as disaster planning and what you can do, the industry is giving, part of their underwriting now is they're asking for your disaster plan. So if you don't have one, you're missing out on some credits. So that's a financial incentive. Brokerage firms like Bollinger, we have templates that we can offer to our clients in the help and preparation to our risk management services. We have a whole internet library of documents and materials. So the firms that do most of the co-op and condo work in the brokerage side should be in a position to offer assistance if you don't have them. We don't want to be stepping on toes of management firms, who many of them have their own templates. So we can be supplemental on that. But it will be in an underwriting, as we go on through the cycle of we come out of the post-Sandy, the carriers will be asking to see a disaster plan. It'll be part of the underwriting checklist. You don't have one? How come? You're gonna lose a credit.
So that brings to the point that I think we made it session 1. Some of the firms that we had offered evaluations of the properties to go in and develop emergency plans, actually by doing an on-site for a particular building and helping with the development.
Just turn it towards you. Just turn it more towards you. No.
So that these firms were able to develop these plans for the cooperative condominiums property owners based on an inspection of the property, and actually did that and offered that. And I believe that the firms that we have, and I know several, including ServPro, Maxons, et cetera, that offer these services free to the property owners, so that that plan becomes what the insurance company is going to be asking for, correct?
Yeah.
Good.
Because a lot of what we have is going to be generic.
Yeah.
But if you have a very finite problem in Chelsea or Tribeca or out in the Rockaways or areas in Brooklyn, Red Hook or some area, that's going to have to be customized by a firm such as that or some other local authority that you may have. As far as the flood zones, that is a problem. We have software in our office where we can get flood certifications, but it's generic FEMA software. So it's a combination of working with architects and engineers if there needs to be documents filed with the Army Corps. And that's where we can only provide what's available in the FEMA database. So between the New York City database and what we can access from our software as a licensed distributor of FEMA products. And you can't get the certifications you need, then you have to work with specific engineers, and there are a number of firms that specialize in doing this kind of work.
Is your information publicly available, or do you have to be
Owen? Microphone.
Did you get that? I asked.
I think that's software that we subscribe to,
Okay.
the FEMA certifications.
Right. Okay.
But the New York City Gov gives you the zones,
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
okay?
Thank you, James. Now, Rob, while you're coming up to the lectern, excellent. I just want to pass a comment to James Barry. I'm sure that James and James will talk because as you're setting up your curriculum and the property managers need so much help with this, we want the staff to tell us what they think about the emergency plan in the building. And of course, you want them to know what is it that the insurance companies are looking for, so the staff can be gathering the core information and then give it to the managers to package for the insurance company. Rob, thank you. And if you want to just take a second and talk about what your firm does and so forth.
Thank you, Margie. Thank you, James. My name is Rob Cecier, and I'm a partner at Daniels, Norelli, Scully, and Cecier, as Margie stated. Oh, closer. Basically, we're a medium-sized firm located in Regal Park, Queens. We have a second office in Carl Place in Nassau County. We do mostly real estate, civil litigation, and landlord-tenant litigation. We do some trust and estates, but we represent probably 100 co-ops and condos, maybe plus a few more. We do a lot of residential landlord representation. So we see basically a whole area of the real estate field. What James touched on was kind of important. What we have seen over the past 12, 13 years have been the two different disasters, natural disasters and the man-made, as James said. From a legal standpoint, what to do to prepare, most people don't really look to prepare on the legal end. Unfortunately, the legal side, it's not really looked at until there's a problem. So it's usually the last thing. If there's a disaster, everybody's scrambling to get power back up and the shareholders' tenants back in, but nobody's thinking about, well, who's gonna sue us on this? Or, what issues are gonna come up with the insurance, and are we covered properly, and do we have to go to the insurance to force them to pay us more? Sorry, James, but that's just one of the things that does happen with the insurance from our end. One of the things that I'm sure most people would be surprised of, and I was very surprised when I read this and kind of lived through it, back in 9/11, the amount of litigation that came out of 9/11 in terms of residential and commercial real estate was minimal. You can count on one hand the amount of lawsuits there were. What happened was, it was just something we've never really seen. Landlords got together with the tenants and the shareholders and the businesses, and it was more of a, let's work this thing out than let's litigate this. More people were released from their leases than we've ever seen. They didn't want to force people to live somewhere downtown if they didn't want to. We represent a big complex downtown Manhattan, and I don't think we had one lawsuit. It was the nature of that type of disaster. We don't necessarily see that in a natural disaster. In Sandy, it's just starting to happen for us. It's been months now, but the dust is settling, the smoke is clearing, the waters were receded, and now we see the damage. The buildings are trying to rectify all the problems, but now people are coming forward on our end. So from a legal aspect, it's to be prepared is really to know what documents govern your type of building. So, we have we have co-ops, we have condos, we have residential, we have small buildings, we have large buildings. The first thing that's very important, and everybody always, you know,
Rob, you just want to speak more into
more,
it.
okay, sorry. Nobody really wants to pay attention to those issues if there isn't a problem. Most of the time, I get a phone call, I answer, it's, Rob, I got a problem. It's not, Rob, what do you think if this situation ever happened? I'm not sure I ever got that question yet, but maybe today that'll start happening, because now people realize that these disasters is something that, you know, at least they're telling us is going to happen more and more. So it's important to know, if you represent a co-op, where am I looking to find out in the documents where I have to look to see how my shareholders are protected, or what I have to do to protect the building. So in a co-op, basically, you're looking at your bylaws and your proprietary lease. In a rental building, generally there's a lease. And in a condominium, it's a little less, because the condominium owners have ownership of their units. So you're really worried about the common areas, and then depending on if the physical plan has one boiler or how the electric is divided. So these are the things that's important to know for all your different buildings. I mean, we could probably stay up here, you know, for 6-8 hours going over every little possibility, but it's more of an overview of what we can do to take care of these issues. Just going back to 9/11, one of the issues that we have seen that has taken a long time is we basically just dealt with an issue regarding security. Now, I know you can't go in a building, especially in Manhattan anymore, without having your ID out. So how does that pertain to people that are involved in residential buildings? Well, most residential buildings, if you live there, you walk in, not a problem, there may be a doorman, you say hello, you go up. But I've been seeing buildings now that are requiring ID, especially bigger buildings where you can't keep track of who the guests are and who the shareholders and the tenants. So we're dealing with a rental building in Queens that actually just in the past few months implemented a situation where they want to use an ID system. So they switched over to a new key system, or key fob system, and then they required all of the tenants, because it's a rental building, to come in and bring their ID. Hand in a copy of your ID, we'll record it, you get your keys. Sounds like a great plan. You're protecting all the residents of the building, and you know who's coming and going. If there's a problem, you can prepare for it. Well, DHCR and the city says that's fine. You're not protected, your ID is not protected, it's a driver's license, everybody asks for it. So we had a tenant that actually went to Queens Court on a lockout saying, I'm not giving my ID, so I didn't get a key, therefore I can't get in my building anymore. And right now, there's a judge in Queens County that is backing that tenant's rights. So these are the things that now come to us, and how do you prepare for this? If a board or a landlord asks you guys, hey, can we do this? Why not? Sounds like a great idea. Everybody asks for ID. Well, these are the things that nobody sees, and these are the things we have to start thinking about. I honestly don't believe this case is really going to stick. I think if it is appealed and it's still in question, an appellate court will absolutely back the landlord's rights and the tenants in the building to protect everybody more than just one. So these are types of issues that we see stemming from 9/11. But in terms of natural disasters, what can we do? In a building, when there's a flood like we had, and I know that's the big thing on everybody's mind, we had these floods, these winds. From a legal standpoint, what services are given to the occupants? So usually we'll hear what's called essential services, and you have to give essential services. So essential services in buildings are hot water, heat, electric, and what happens when those aren't given? Now, the first thing everybody's doing is scrambling to kind of get the building back up and running. But if you have a building, like James said, his building, a commercial building, it was evacuated, you couldn't get back in. But a lot of the residential buildings, people were still in the buildings. They had sporadic electric or no electric, the hot water, the water got down to the boiler, they had nowhere to go. So these are issues that, when it happens, we're trying to get them back up. But we're seeing now, more and more, what's happening with tenants that are coming in saying, well, I didn't have heat for 10 days, or I didn't have electric for 2 weeks, and I want something back. So What happens is, the courts really are pro tenant, as we all know. And we going into court and seeing some of these cases where people were looking for abatements and looking for something back. So sometimes it's a good idea to have this plan. If it's a co-op board, to sit down with the board and say, hey, look, we may have a situation in the future where shareholders are going to come forward and look for money. And I don't want to talk myself out of business, but to go to court on some of these cases and spend thousands of dollars litigating over something we know a judge is going to back a tenant on and give them some sort of an abatement, what we've been advising our clients is sit down with some of these tenants and try to work them out. Just in terms of an example, I have a situation, again in Queens County, we practice in all the boroughs, but just happens to be in Illinois and Queens, where it wasn't so much a Sandy issue, but Sandy certainly didn't help, where there was a leaking parapet wall and lintel over windows, and Sandy kind of made it worse in these last few storms. The situation in this building has been there for probably 2+ years. The building is a horrible financial situation, which they're trying to work out right now. But we've been in court for over 1.5 years with one shareholder who has gotten civil penalties from the city, who has gotten an abatement from the court, who has gotten to move to another apartment while his entire apartment was being re-sheetrocked. All the work was done about 6 weeks ago, and then when we had a storm 3 or 4 weeks ago, the whole apartment leaked again. We're right back in court under the same case, and I kind of just been throwing up my hands because the board really has no plan. They're just now, they went out, they hired an engineer, only to find out that the engineer wanted $21,000, wasn't in their budget, not hiring the engineer. They were going to go back to the original contractor. The problem with that, they're litigating with that contractor and just got a $38,000 judgment against the building because they weren't able to prove certain issues. That was prior to our representation, but this building was not prepared for these situations. And although not a natural disaster like Sandy, it is a serious problem for this building, and it's growing. So the boards have a plan for this, and they can sit down with their insurance, with their managing agent, maybe even with their accountant to come up with a plan. This is what's important. This building left everything till afterwards, and they're paying the price for it. It's really, really, causing a toll on this building financially and otherwise. So some of the other issues that we've seen with Sandy from a legal aspect are what happens with damage to the building. And I know everybody's first thought is let's go to the insurance, let's find out what we covered. In this situation, insurance carriers were so inundated with claims and issues. We were taking calls. What do we do in this situation? What do we do in this situation? We have a tree from the neighboring property that fell on our property. Who's responsible? A lot of people don't know these issues, and we can't prepare for everything, but we can now learn from what we lived through to try to bring us a little more informative if or when there's another situation. Trees are an important issue. I think it's one of the questions, and James had answered, regarding what can you do. I don't think we saw enough entities, people, landlords, managing agents looking into the situation of trees. I mean, I know there's a lot of wonderful tree services out there, but there are so many trees that were, toppled because of Sandy. And if anybody lives on the island and drives the northern state, we're months past Sandy, and they're not even close to pulling all the trees out of the northern state. There's still piles and piles. Maybe that's something to look at. Because what happens when one of these trees fall? Trees falls on your property, okay, you call your insurance carrier, nobody calls me. But what happens when that giant 50, 60-foot tree falls on the neighboring property and crushes their cars, their trucks, their windows, whatever? Who's responsible for that? A lot of people didn't know that. Basically, it's not the landowner, it's the property owner next door. It's their claim. What we have seen, especially in the smaller, not in the commercial situations, is neighbors were really stepping up, cutting down the trees, paying for the cost, maybe not the damage, but these are things, to keep in mind. So what can we do in that respect is, take a look at our properties. Again, what we're talking about is being prepared, and I'm kind of put more focus on what to do to avoid illegal situations, because that ultimately is what you really want to do. I don't really want to come up here and talk about, okay, you're getting sued or you want to sue, let's do that. It's more, what can we do to reduce the amount of litigation after, you know, a natural disaster like this? And that obviously benefits everybody. Certain things to look at also is what have we done in the past? It sounded like a great idea. For example, NYU Hospital. They had to evacuate the entire hospital. Why? They had a wonderful backup system, but it was in the basement. They never expected to get 8, 10 feet of water in the basement, killed their entire backup system. So this is something to think about. You know, your building may not have been harmed on the first go around with Sandy, but it may be something in the future that your building may get water that didn't this time. Well, what do I have in the basement? Do we have a backup generator? I mean, that's huge. You couldn't even touch it. I wish I owned a generator company. You know, I could quit practicing law. But, you know, now you see them again, and, you know, my wife bugs me, let's get a generator. You know, we have a small generator, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. You know, and we've been here 15 years. We've never used it once. Who knows, it'll be another 15 years, but, you know, that's usually not my luck. So we have to be prepared, and that's something. Because what happens when the power goes out? Now you're looking at, okay, we can correct everything, but there's no, again, essential services at the building. And then we're looking at potential lawsuits after. So I know now that, again, the smoke is clearing, and we sit back and we're seeing from the legal aspect what's happening. So we're getting, again, these tenant suits. There are some class action suits. If anybody saw in the news day, there's a very large class action suit that came out of Oceanside, Island Park area, where a group of individuals was suing LIPA because they said they weren't taking care of the trees, the lines, and stuff like that. So these are the issues that are coming up, again, post-natural disaster that we have to take a look at. So if our building is in order, you can't always be prepared for everything, but you can certainly be prepared for some things and then know how to take care of them and what the end result would be, and to reduce any potential, you know, liability in terms of, you know, legal cases and suits. One other issue that's come up recently, just in the past 2 weeks, that is somewhat important, and this goes more towards commercial situations. There a lot of buildings have commercial tenants, doctors, storefronts, different situations, but a lot of managers and staff aren't aware of really what the governing docs, the lease, really deal with in terms of disasters. Now, commercial leases, for the most part, there aren't too many ways to get out of these leases. What's important to know is if the lease has any type of out clause. So I have a situation right now with a doctor down on Wall Street, a chiropractor, who's been in business for 15 years, and wonderful business. When Irene hit, he was hit pretty hard. When Sandy was hit, basically put him out of business. So he's struggling right now, and he called me about a month ago to get out of his lease. We try to work with his landlord. It's a brand new building owner, and the building owner said, sorry, we're not really interested. You have to pay. It's $17,000 a month. It's a solo chiropractor, and he's well, you know, over his head. So what do we do? Now, he's had this lease for years. He has no idea what's in that lease. Now, he's the tenant. The landlord, on the other hand, kind of knows, but isn't making any offers. In his lease is what's called a good guy clause. I see people shaking their heads, so people may be familiar. For those that aren't, it's something to be very, you know, aware of. What a good guy clause is, it's basically when a company or an individual comes in and wants to lease property, but doesn't want to be held personally liable, so they want to sign as a corporation. But the landlord says, well, I'm not letting you sign as a corporation. If you default, that's nothing for me. So we want you to sign personally. So then the tenant signs what's called a good guy clause, and it's kind of a middle ground between the two. In a nutshell, it would basically say for the tenant, if the tenant's in good standing, is paid in full, and he gives the landlord a certain amount of time notice. The one I was dealing with was 3 months. So he gives 3 months notice today, so he'll pay 3 additional months, give up his security, but the landlord will let him out of the lease. So a lot of people don't even know that this is in their lease. They're just signing, their attorney didn't explain it to them, or explained it to them 10, 15 years ago, and they forgot about it. And that's exactly what I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with a managing agent that wasn't really aware of it, and the tenant that really didn't know. He was just gonna walk away. His liability by walking away was basically $500,000 plus, individually, himself. With his good guy clause, if he stays in for 3 months, and I said, if his rent's $17,000 and he makes, let's say, $7,000 a month, his liability is only $10,000 a month for 3 months. So $30,000, plus I think he had 16 in security. So you're talking his total liability would be $46,000. His choice was to roll the dice, leave now, and see if he gets, sued by the landlord, and potentially a $500,000+ judgment. So these are things that we should know, because as building staff and representatives, it's something we can bring to our clients. Landlord that may not know, or if a commercial unit is in a condo or co-op. So these are important things. So it's always good to take a look at your documents. I know there's not many of us sitting at our desk with our feet up, just looking for something to do, but it's something that's kind of important, and now we've learned that this is important. So, most of these leases are 20, 30 pages. Take a couple of, minutes, look a couple of pages the next time. You don't have to do it all at one time, but something good to just keep it on, out there in the back of your mind. And also, that's what the attorneys are for. So, you have a question, you come to something like this, you ask me, you have the attorney on retainer, you ask the attorney, but these are the things that are important, is ask questions, because, that's what we're there for, and can't know everything ourselves. One last thing I want to say to avoid situations after, suits, of course, is what we're referring to, is information. Can't say it enough. You have to get information to your occupants, whether they're renters or owners. They're entitled to the same information. A shareholder at a co-op isn't entitled to more just because they're a shareholder. An occupant that resides there, that's their home. They need to know what is happening. People that are left in the dark, that are just sitting, I don't mean that figuratively, also I guess if there's no power, but they need to know, we don't have power. Well, is anything being done? Is management or the building owner getting a generator, a backup generator? Are they hiring an electrician to fix the power? Because that's what we see. We see the people coming into court saying, I was out of power for 10 days, I didn't even know what was going on. Somebody could have come to me and told me this, or we're doing this, or we spent $20,000 already. Maybe we work together. But we do see that the situations where the occupants have no information causes more of a situation when we get to the legal side, and there are cases. It's so easy these days, I'm sure everybody knows, to litigate and bring a suit, whether it's a $5,000 claim in a small claims case, which is $5.64 for an individual to file, or a housing case where it's pretty much even less than that if the tenant's filing a tenant-initiated action. So the avenues are there for the occupants. And when one finds out in the building that this one did it and got a $1,500 abatement, guess what happens? The floodgates open, and then the building ends up spending 10, 20 times that in legal fees to try to, battle all those issues. So in that respect, I just want to leave you that's probably the most important part. And that goes to not only the legal end, that goes to, all the ends. It's the shareholders, they should have this, the occupants, the residents, the tenants, they should know what's going on. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on at those times, but especially in today's day and age with email, you can email shareholders. Some buildings have websites with information on them. That's a good way of doing it. So, just like to leave you with that, and more we can give, and the less that hopefully comes back. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Just a comment. On looking at your documents, every contract should have an abstract. So what everyone wants to have is whether it's a lease or whether it's your elevator contract. And so once you have the abstract, then you're creating in a template of all the things you want to be looking for. So I don't know if you want to just touch on that a little bit.
Right, as Margie said, what we do, and an abstract, a template, with representing a lot of buildings, it's very difficult to remember, well, what is this, who insurance does this building have, and you know, who does this for this building? So what we do in our business is we actually have a binder for each building. And that binder contains basically all of the pertinent information. So we know that, you know, where the proprietary lease is. If we need something, it's there. We know what insurance carrier they have, and it's there, the information. And as those things change, we change them, and it's in a centralized spot. The other good point about that is, you know, everybody likes to take vacation. Somebody covers for you. God forbid there's a problem. Well, where do they get all this information? If it's in a centralized spot, easy to find, it definitely benefits everybody, the individual, the company, everybody. The books can keep, like I was saying before about taking notes on, you know, look at a couple of pages. You can take those notes and just keep them in those binders. So if you have a lease, you can keep the terms in the lease. You can have what's very important, like outside contractors. We see in a lot of times laundry contracts have a renewal clause, or will have, if you don't notify them 90 days before they expire, they're going to automatically renew. These are important parts. These are not only for natural disaster situations, but any situation. And for our topic today, it's also very important because everything's centralized now. You can go to this situation, go right back to your binder, look at it. Also, what happens is it cuts down on your time, because if you have a building, and let's say you use Josh's company, Bargold, and your attorney and Josh's attorney battle out a contract and a lease. At the time, it's very fresh in your mind. You know, your attorney's explaining to you what happened. You have it in front of you, but you put that in a file somewhere, and 5 years later, you never remember. Now you go to your next building. Maybe there's a problem. Well, what happens? I don't remember what happened. I don't even know where that file is anymore. Everything in a centralized location helps. And let's say your next building, you love Josh's, company. You're going to use him again. You know what his contracts contain, and you go back to that first building. You have that information. You move it right to the second. So these are the things that we do can prepare for situations. And again, all this stems to a disaster. Well, what happens when there's a disaster? Everybody's scrambling for information. So if you know the information, or at least know where the information is, you're not killing yourself to try to find everything and put it together and get answers to your clients, which can be very frustrating for everybody.
Thank you. Any questions at this point? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Josh Coleman, Margot Storage.
When Rob came here, glowing start. We don't have battles. I'm Josh Goldman of Bargold Storage. We're a Long Island City-based storage company. We run storage for co-ops, condos, rentals in the basements of their buildings. And as you can imagine, basements mean water when there are water issues. Everybody's got pictures on their desks around them. Anybody have an idea of what this is? It's a storage room. What happened in the storage room? It's like that puzzle. You see a pool of water in the middle of the room. What happened? Does anybody want to take a guess what happened with this one? This was one of our locations in Coney Island, and the water, we have floor inserts in each of our rooms. The floor inserts protect the room generally against 3 or 4 inches of water. And that's generally what there is in a basement. But in this particular room, this room happened to be empty at the time, this floor was raised to about 6.5 feet by the surging ocean. And then it got wedged at the top of the storage unit. This was some of our locations after Sandy, and this is what we were dealing with in about 300 storage rooms. The laundry companies, storage companies, we all had our own issues, but most of it was with the surge. And then what do you do? How do you handle the occupants with all their storables when they may not even be at the building? And we've got to get in there to refurb the units, to throw out the hazardous material now, and to render that entire room safe. So what we started doing, much like Rob mentioned, just communication, is we started drafting letters. And we started doing this the day after Sandy. Our office was open that whole week. We had letters, and they're in the packet. We had letters that there's a problem, we have to get into your space. We had letters that miraculously your space was untouched. There were letters, we have reports that there was minimal damage, please check your units and get back to us. But the best way of finding out is getting in touch with residents in the building and sending our crews also. When we identified a building where it had to be a clean out, and again, we had about 300 storage units that fell into this, we set days and weeks up where we'd have crews at the building. And what the remediation was taking all the person's belongings out with them, having them go through if anything could be salvaged, replacing all the floors, such as this one, which got wet for some amount of time. And you can imagine, if you had storables on top of that floor is not rising, like in an empty unit. So going through this whole process, it then required either sanitizing or replacing the steel walls. And if there was sheetrock behind the steel, oftentimes either we as Bargold or the building would have to cut that sheetrock out back to the bare cement or the block walls to render that area not capable of collecting mold, collecting mildew, collecting any of that bad water. So through the series of letters that I presented in front of you, we were able to deal with our 300 units that were in the flood-prone areas that got wet in a very effective way. We kept the customers, the occupants informed at all times. We made phone calls, countless phone calls to each individual, as well as sent the letters so we'd have a permanent record. So communication is definitely one of the key things that we found. We also kept logs on our end, which is in the last page of the handout. As we would refurb each of these individual storage units, we would indicate the date that it was refurbed, so we had an indication that we actually went there, we did it. We have in our system in the office, we actually have a barcoding system, so we knew by the barcode of which rep did it, but we needed a representation to say which units were refurbed and which ones still had to be refurbed. We mentioned before something primitive as sandbags. In a lot of our locations in Coney Island, some of the buildings had 2 feet of water in the lobby, and the storage area was on lobby level, but miraculously, because the staff sandbagged different parts of the building, the storage rooms were dry. And that's why you'll see in here several letters that were sent. We're fearing the worst, schedule an appointment, we're going to be there for this week, and then we sent back another letter saying, hey, we checked it out, and as far as we can tell, there's no damage. But please, still, check the unit and get back to us. So communication, as Rob mentioned, to stay away from any potential litigation is very important in situations like this. The last part of it was people asking for credits, which is a very, very sort of business decision, sort of touchy-feely thing of what to do in what location. Namely, because if we react within 5 days, 6 days of a situation, and we get their storage area back up and operational, then there's one school that says, hey, we did our job, we refurbed everything, we're probably acting quicker than the rest of the building. Really, I don't see why credit has to be given. And if you ask those people, did you get a credit on parking? Did you get a credit on your maintenance? Did you get a credit on other things in that building? The answer is always no, but they look to us, hey, can I get my credit? So that was very much a building by building, instance by instance, and we didn't have insurance for business interruption. I don't even know if business interruption would have covered that, but in some cases we did. again, is goodwill to avoid potential standoff and a legal dispute, if you want to take it that far. We did offer some credits in some cases, but in other cases we didn't. Now, we did have insurance for the property or the storage units in the locations, and this was interesting because after we're doing this for about 2-3 weeks, refurbing the units, I called up the insurance carrier and I was like, listen, I don't, I'm not saying I want to even put it in, but I've got money I've expended in terms of getting these units back up. I've a lot of labor's gone into this. Basically, the month and a half has been lost due to Sandy. Is there coverage on this? And it came back that I had a policy, Bargold had a policy that covered the storage units in the locations up to an aggregate amount of I think it was $50,000. So that was a relatively smooth transaction in terms of showing the proof for what had happened and how much we spent on the refurb and getting the money back. So that is something that I didn't even know Bargold had, and it benefited because it made the loss through Sandy somewhat less. We spent far over the $50,000 in terms of refurbing. The floors themselves for each of the 300 units probably ran us about $100. So that's before you get into the manpower, the steel, everything that needed to be replaced. But it just was an experience that we've been through twice now, because Irene was almost to this level, but not quite the extensive flooding. But anytime it rains really heavy, we don't have a good feeling of Bargold. When the waters, I was in my apartment on the Upper East Side, thankfully I was part of the HAV group. But when they showed the water get to Avenue C and get to Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper and all that, we have buildings right in that area, and they all have sloped entrances into the basements. So you can imagine that if the water had, and thankfully it hadn't, gotten to those streets, I would just go over them again in my mind that if it crests that little slope, that's it for the basement. My storage, anything that's down. And thankfully, obviously, this is no comparison to the loss of life and loss of property that everybody had in Sandy, and I have to say that, but it was 2 months in our lives that we'll never forget, and obviously going forward, following the plan of communication always works for us. We will look to be better prepared in terms of generators. We brought generators out to those buildings that didn't have power so we could work and we could maintain the storage areas and get them up so the building didn't have to worry about that in their refurb. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you. James Barry from 32BJ Thomas Shortman Training.
Good afternoon. So I just wanted to give you a little background for those of you who don't know. The 32BJ Training Fund actually it acts as a school for building service workers in local 32BJ. And we offer training, industry training, academic and computer training. And we have a new facility in Manhattan on 18th Street. But we also work with community colleges, so we can do training in Queens. We're in Queens College, we're in Hostos, and we're also in New York City Tech. So over the course of, we've been around for 40 years, we trained, it's about 100 course titles that we have, and we do have some emergency preparedness titles that I wanted to review with you. But over the course of the 40 years we've been operating, whenever there's an emergency or some kind of new industry trend, we generally like to do some kind of large rollout to reach a lot of the members at one time. So around 9/11, we did a program called Safe and Secure, which it was a 3-hour training for building service workers on site, and it was offered by police, John Jay College, and also people from the police academy would go to the site and do security and observation awareness, safety awareness. And we did that for just about 4,000 people over a couple of years. We also did it around green building. We had a large program called 1,000 Green Supers, which is a 40-hour training. That was, a lot of it was organized with the management companies. It was on company time, and it resulted in certification for superintendents and also green building plans where they would identify sustainability and efficiency projects in their building, and we would work with them in a program called Green Coaching to help them implement some of these projects. So around Sandy, we have a couple of things in the works. We do want to do a 3-hour training similar to Safe and Secure, where we will go to buildings. And we're in the process of developing what that training will look like. In the meantime, we do have a couple of courses I wanted to review. One is security awareness, and that's really about how to interact with emergency personnel when they arrive on the scene. So it's some basic kind of awareness training, and we do that at our locations, and also we can go to a building. So if you have 10 or more workers, or you want to just get workers from several buildings in the area, we can do a training as long as they're eligible 32BJ members. We also do CERT training. So CERT is Community Emergency Response Teams, and that's a large training, or a pretty long training. It's 30 hours, and in New York City it's administered by the Office of Emergency Management. And the goal with that is to provide more of an intensive training and kind of deputize, I guess in a certain way, staff to help in emergency situations. So they would do light search and rescue. They teach you like how to, if you have to assist somebody, what's the proper way of assisting somebody. And generally, if there's an emergency area, they're able to go like a little further than a regular member of the public would be able to in that case. So we've offered that on site at our building on 18th Street. And at this point, there's several of them going on in the city. So if you have any members, any 32BJ members that were interested in that, there are some trainings going on. And I have a course catalog, and I have some business cards if you'd like to talk to me about that. So that training, we have had members do that, and that's been something that people can use in their communities, but also obviously, on the job as well. So after the storm, we had a lot of, we did a call for what stories from members. What did you do during the storm before to prepare? What did you do during the storm, and what have you done since? So the responses have been rolling in. Some of the things that we kind of broke it into before, during, and after. That's how we're looking at prepping for the seminar, and also incorporating some emergency plans from management companies who have been contributing those to us. So if anyone is developing a plan that they would like to contribute, so we can sort of align our message when we do our training with the message that they're getting from building owners and property managers, that would be really helpful. So before, some of the things that came up in preparing was obviously around supplies and gas and things of that nature, but also just identifying who can stay over for several nights. Is there a location in the building if you have to have staff stay over for several nights? Who is able to leave their home, and maybe people that don't have children or whatever their living situation is, they could leave their home for a few days. So that was something, I think, just in general to sort of take note of that and kind of prepare in that way. Special needs tenants, that was something that some buildings had, some of the staff were aware of that kind of unofficially, but just really kind of mapping out who lives where if they have any special needs. And the contact information, some of the buildings, everyone had contact information for tenants and for workers, but in the case where the system went down, if it was a communication system, some of that was lost, so just the importance of having that hard copy as well in the event that you lose electricity and power in the buildings. And during the storm, some of the obstacles, A lot of it was around communication, if radio systems went out, so people had two-way radios, but the charge would go at a certain point. So additional generators for that, and just any kind of battery backup was something that people brought up. Running the stairwells, like having Christmas lights if they don't have a generator, but some kind of lights to sort of illuminate the stairwells and do regular patrols, like every 4 hours was kind of like a rule of thumb. People would go to different floors and just check on tenants, just make sure there weren't any emergency situations. And then afterwards, one of the things that came up was that you can't just turn the power back on. So just making sure everything is off. Also making sure all the faucets are off. So when the water, if you did have to turn off water, that when it came back on, there weren't any problems with leaks. And what we're trying to do with the seminar that we're putting together, and just any input is definitely valuable to us. There's a lot of tasks that people were doing that it's kind of a gray area. There's cleanup, and then there's the cleanup that after that crew leaves, like what if someone's working and they're not sure if there's molds that they're in the area that they're working in. We do safety around that. If there's flood waters, and they shouldn't be asked to walk into them, but if people do go into them, what are some things that you should be aware of, and what are some personal protective equipment? So we're trying to really work out with people, if you have to do additional tasks or tasks that are out of the ordinary, what's the right way to do those things, or what you should do and what you shouldn't do. There was one case where someone was helping clean up afterwards and threw out some information that was really valuable that they shouldn't have thrown out. So it's like just things like that are coming up. There just has to be communication around that. So we do want to roll that out pretty soon, and that's something we want to do on site. We're looking forward to the Building Resiliency Task Force, which Urban Green Council is running, which was commissioned by the mayor's office, to come up with ways to respond in the future and issues that people can tackle in terms of building resiliency. So these are all things we would like to just align our message with all of these task forces that are going on now. So look forward to getting the information and rolling out a program to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. Do any of the other speakers have a fast comment at this moment or question? Because before I do that, Peter, Funk, do you have a comment or anything you want to offer?
I do.
Okay, do you want to take, this is Peter Funk, attorney, going to give us a few comments.
I have one.
Okay.
Sorry I wasn't able to get here for all of your presentations. I'm Peter Funk.
Yeah, but just the microphone, put straight in,
I'm
please.
Peter Funk with Funk and Zeither, and one of my focuses is in the energy area. And what will be very interesting to find out at the time of the next disaster is what happens with respect to people who install generators. Generators are being installed all over, including in multifamily buildings. Can everyone hear me now? There we go. Once you install a generator, if people move into your building in reliance upon the fact that you have an emergency generator, you will put yourself to a certain extent, possibly, in the position of a utility. Utilities have standards under which they have to operate under the Home Energy Fair Practices Act. And one of the things, for example, that they cannot do is shut off power to people who are disabled or life support or a variety of protections. Say you have a building, someone moves into the building, you have advertising, you have, I'm forgetting for the moment the lease or the proprietary lease and whether there is an integration clause that says only the lease pertains. That there are people on the panel who are more familiar with lease litigation than I am. But let's posit a situation in which someone has moved into the building and you have installed emergency generation, a Hurricane Sandy event occurs, and someone dies, someone is seriously injured because of a lack of electric power. If you're a utility and your tariff, you have a standard, the gross negligence standard. I've represented utilities as well as buildings and others during my career. It's very hard to sue a utility under the gross negligence statute. If you are a regular building and a hurricane problem, the dimension of Hurricane Sandy occurs, you do have defenses. It's a force majeure event. It doesn't imply the duties that you would have if you had a generator, and now you've essentially promised to somebody that you will have backup generation. What was the lessons from Sandy? You can have a generator. Does the generator get flooded? Do you have the generator at a high enough elevation? Do you have fuel pumps that get flooded? Do you have a fuel source? Looking back at Hurricane Katrina, there was extensive litigation about those who had backup generators. Some were in hospitals, and these hit the courts, and liability in some cases was found. It was foreseeable, certainly in New Orleans, that a flood might occur. Now, looking in lower Manhattan, have we seen floods occur before? Sure. There was a northeaster a number of years ago, it might have been 1997, 1990s. It flooded Water Street. Now, looking ahead, if you install that generation, make sure it's going to work. Look at it very carefully. I'm actually giving a presentation on that topic next September down in Atlanta, where we're looking at very extensively. For example, say you put in cogeneration. You look at cogen, and gee, you can save some money. The price of gas is low. It makes a lot of sense to put in cogen. You have space in your basement. You've got to make sure that cogenerator will operate on a synchronous basis. That means that it can operate independent of the electric grid. So those are the kinds of considerations that in the next disaster you should be thinking about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for the panel, or does the panel have anything else they'd like to add? And so now, Greg, you're on.
Well, I want to just finish this up. We were talking earlier.
Okay. You want to? Okay. Why don't you use? How about that?
Okay.
And then I'll be over here.
We're talking about FEMA. As you know, FEMA is tied, and Homeland Security, believe it or not, is tied into the Sandy recovery. Now, for those of you, most of you know that common areas of co-ops, condominiums, homeowners associations are not covered by FEMA relief. Individual apartments or units are. Well, the National Association of Housing Co-ops, the Community Association Institute, and the National Cooperative Business Associations have formed a coalition trying to convince FEMA that they misinterpreted what they call the Stanford Act, that they use to deny and say no, co-ops and all those common areas are business entities and go get a small business loan. So there are two things. One, under the leadership of Congressman Steve Israel, he's talking to FEMA, Homeland Security. He also has a letter that has been so far signed on by 20 Congress members, all from New York and New Jersey, of course. And we also have the support of Senator Mendez of New Jersey. So we're trying to talk to FEMA and trying to convince them. He's also going to be introducing legislation to add the common areas that FEMA will cover. Finally, on this issue, okay, Senator Schumer was successful in getting what's known as a block grant that will be administered by HUD, but it's for all housing, especially for co-ops and condominiums who are not covered under FEMA. And this is a source of money and funding for those buildings. So that's what I wanted. That just came out, I would say on Friday. Schumer has done that for us.
And you don't want to go too far because you've got another topic that you're going to bring up, right? But before we, yes.
Just one quick item in terms of the insurance. A lot of buildings, co-ops, don't require individual shareholders to have insurance on their own belongings. More and more are, but it's an important aspect that we see now. We're seeing a lot of small claims cases coming out of Sandy. Well, I lost my TV, 2 computers. Generally, the building's insurance doesn't cover personal belongings, contents inside an apartment. So it is important, if you have any buildings out there, to put in a letter, even if it's not an official requirement, you can put a memo to your shareholders, even your tenants, making them aware, because a lot of these people don't understand that their personal belongings are not covered by this. And then you're gonna get, calls, can I put this through the building's insurance? It's not gonna cover it. So very important, something simple, you could do a blanket memo to even rental tenants, that they should have similar. It benefits other issues too, shareholder to shareholder, flooding, but in natural disasters, none of that is covered, and a lot of times shareholders aren't even aware of that. So something also to think. Yeah, it's very affordable. I think from somewhere in the area, $200 to $300 a year for a contract. Right, that low. So something to keep in mind.
And that would be in an abstract, our insurance requirements for occupants. Right. Okay. We have a question. This is losing battery, so you can have.
Hi, my name is Virgil. I'm working with International House. I have a question for a few of you guys. As you know, the fire department of New York City, they have emergency action plan director. They have fire safety director. Therefore, they have standard templates for the emergency actions. For people who are not required to have that kind of emergency planning, we don't have really a template. As you mentioned there, we have the Office of Emergency Management. How exactly do we work with them? We don't know exactly what they do. We do a plan and we don't know what exactly is required for us. The financial institution or the insurance companies, they are saying, we have this template. Some private companies, they said, we would like you to do this and this. How far we are responsible and how much we can be held liable for whatever it's emergency action plan.
Rob? Insurance, legal?
If we understand the question, if there's a requirement to have a plan, I don't think there's any liability if you didn't have the plan.
Except if you're under the fire department statute.
Right, if you're under a certain statute, but otherwise, I don't think there's any requirement that I'm aware of.
Besides the insurance company who is going to mark us with 1 credit or 2 credits, otherwise we are not liable.
From an insurance standpoint, that would be per
It's
insurance company.
prudence. You're representing a level of prudence that you are best in your class by having a disaster plan.
Therefore, if you don't,
Insurers they're looking at your loss experience, they're looking at the condition of the building, they're looking if you have outstanding insurance recommendations. Now they're going to be asking, do you have a disaster plan? Aside from the statutory one that if you're under the fire department's requirements, you will have it. Otherwise, you'll have violation.
therefore, if you don't
So
have,
you're representing to the insurance marketplace that you're best in class by having it. It's not statutory that we know of. But it might be. I wouldn't be surprised if the New York City comes out with some kind of requirements. They're very capable of it.
Right, so-
It's right on the forefront of a lot of these kind of issues. It could very easily happen after Sandy.
Well, and it probably will, but this is one of the things that came in on part 1, which is if your peers are doing it, if you are putting yourself as being in the business of managing property and everyone knows we should have a disaster plan, when you get sued, you're going to be on the hook for whatever it is, problems.
therefore, if you don't have one,
I believe it's not if, it's when.
Okay, James, I just,
Go ahead. That's fine.
no, I mean in the microphone, not sit down.
I believe it's not if, it's when.
If it's not what?
If it's not if, it's when you will be
Okay.
required to have a disaster plan. So why not do it now?
but my question is more, if you don't have you are not liable, you are not responsible. If you have it and you
I don't
don't,
know of any
Yeah,
statutes.
no, well, no one here is gonna say that. No, you're not responsible.
Okay.
We're giving you all the reasons
Gregor, you're
why
an
you should
expert
be.
on a lot of this, the co-op condo statutes. I don't believe that there are any requirements in this.
There is no requirements in residential buildings for a, quote, disaster plan. We do have to adhere to the fire department of where the elevators are, where the stairwells are, and your exits that we have to give out every year. But there is talk,
It could very easily happen.
because it happens in the commercial buildings, so they're probably talking about it in the residential. And as you said, it's not when, it's
Not if, it's when.
Yes.
Right, and
So why not have it now?
Exactly. And a sharp attorney could probably find something in OSHA. You know, that you could get hung up on. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment about that. I have a comment about that. There is a model for a potential plan. If you're a healthcare facility, you must have a disaster plan. And that, and I'm sure our panelists are familiar with that. And I think if I were New York City, I might look to that as a possible model for a disaster plan. I would also like to add a footnote to what I said earlier. I was talking somewhat off the top of my head. And the point I wanted to make is an irony, is that your very actions in installing a backup generator, if you're not careful, might subject you to liability.